Dr. Jonah Velasquez had always believed that languages died for a reason. Like extinct species, they represented evolutionary dead ends, ways of thinking and speaking that humanity had outgrown or abandoned. He'd spent 15 years studying these linguistic fossils at Columbia University, piecing together fragments of Sumerian tablets and deciphering linear A inscriptions, never imagining that one day these dead tongues would speak to him from the heavens. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. Jonah fumbled for his phone, squinting at the unknown number through sleep-crusted eyes. Dr. Velasquez. The voice was crisp, professional, with the kind of authority that cut through drowsiness like a scalpel. This is Director Sarah Chun from the Department of Advanced Research. We need your expertise. The Department of what? Jonah sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He'd never heard of any such organization. I'll send a car. Be ready in 20 minutes. The line went dead before he could protest. 23 minutes later, Jonah found himself in the back of a black sedan with tinted windows, speeding through the empty streets of Manhattan toward an address in Queens that his GPS insisted didn't exist. The driver, a woman with military bearing and eyes that seemed to catalog every passing shadow, hadn't spoken since picking him up. They stopped at what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. Inside, Jonah discovered a world that defied his understanding of government bureaucracy. The space had been converted into a high-tech facility that wouldn't have looked out of place in a science fiction film. Banks of computers hummed beneath harsh fluorescent lighting, and dozens of technicians worked at stations monitoring displays filled with data streams he couldn't interpret. Director Chin materialized beside him, a compact woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too many impossible things. She wore a simple black suit that somehow conveyed more authority than any uniform. Dr. Velasquez, thank you for coming. I know this is irregular. Irregular is one word for it. Jonah looked around the facility, noting the distinct lack of any identifying markers or official seals. What exactly is the Department of Advanced Research? Chin's smile was thin. We're the people who handle things that don't officially exist yet. Follow me. She led him through a maze of corridors to a soundproof room where a single chair faced a wall of monitors. On the screens, wave patterns danced in hypnotic rhythms, audio visualizations that pulsed with an almost organic quality. 3 weeks ago, Chin began, our satellites detected unusual radio emissions from the sun. Solar radio bursts aren't uncommon, but these were different. They showed clear patterns, too structured to be natural phenomena. Jonah studied the displays. Even without his specialized knowledge, he could see what she meant. The waves had a linguistic quality, like spoken language rendered in electromagnetic form. We ran them through every decryption program in existence. Nothing. Then, someone suggested we might be looking at an actual language, something ancient. Your name came up as one of the few people who might be able to make sense of it. Ancient languages don't come from the sun, Director. No, Chin said quietly. They don't. Which is why we need to know what these do say. She handed him a tablet containing the converted audio files. We've isolated 17 distinct transmission events over the past 3 weeks. Each one lasts exactly 93 minutes and repeats every 72 hours. Jonah put on the offer headphones and selected the first file. What he heard made his blood run cold. The sounds were definitely linguistic. He could hear phonemes, morphemes, the rise and fall of syntax. But the language itself was like nothing in his experience. It contained elements of Proto-Sumerian, touches of Linear A, and grammatical structures that reminded him of ancient Akkadian. Yet it was none of these things, and somehow all of them. This is impossible, he whispered. That's what we were afraid you'd say. But you can translate it. Jonah was quiet for a long time, listening to the eerie transmissions that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to some ancestral part of his brain. Maybe, but I'll need time, and I'll need access to comparative databases. You'll have whatever you need. But Dr. Velasquez, this project is classified at the highest levels. You'll be working here, under full security protocols, until we have answers. How long? Chin's expression was grim. However long it takes. These transmissions are getting stronger, and our models suggest they're building toward something. We need to know what. The next 72 hours blurred together in a haze of coffee, linguistic analysis, and growing unease. Jonah had been given a small apartment in the facility's residential wing. Apparently, the Department of Advanced Research was equipped for long-term isolation projects. His requests for research materials were fulfilled with disturbing efficiency. Rare manuscripts appeared within hours, along with digital access to archaeological databases he'd only dreamed of consulting. The language was a puzzle that seemed to reshape itself as he studied it. Grammatical rules he thought he'd identified would suddenly shift, as if the very structure of the communication was evolving in real time. It reminded him of stories he'd heard about early computer viruses, linguistic malware that adapted to avoid detection. On his third day, he made the first breakthrough. It's not one language, he told Chun during their morning briefing. It's a polyglot, a mixture of multiple ancient tongues, but arranged in a very specific pattern. Whoever created this assumed the listener would understand the relationships between these language families. Created by whom? That's the question, isn't it? Jonah pulled up his analysis on the main display. The transmission uses Sumerian root words for concepts related to containment and binding, Proto-Egyptian for temporal expressions, time, duration, cycles, linear A for what I can only describe as warnings or prohibitions. Chun leaned forward. You can read linear A. No one can read linear A completely. But in this context, with these other linguistic elements as guides. He paused, unsure how to explain the intuitive leap his mind had made. It's like having a Rosetta Stone for dead languages. The pattern teaches you how to interpret the components. What does it say? Jonah hesitated. Over the past 3 days, as he decoded fragments of the transmission, a narrative had begun to emerge that challenged everything he thought he knew about human history, cosmology, and the nature of the sun itself. The earliest segments appear to be historical records, he said carefully. They describe events that supposedly occurred thousands of years ago. A war between entities they call the Star Builders and the Void Seekers. Science fiction. Maybe. But the astronomical references are surprisingly accurate. They describe stellar mechanics that we've only recently begun to understand. The hydrogen fusion process, solar magnetic fields, coronal mass ejections. How would ancient humans know about these things? Chin didn't answer, but Jonah saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of suspicion she'd already harbored. There's more, he continued. The later segments contain what I can only describe as a warning. They claim that our sun isn't just a star, it's a prison. Something called the Devourer of Worlds was bound inside it eons ago, and the transmissions suggest it's stirring. The language becomes increasingly urgent in recent transmissions. They reference cycles and epochs, suggest that the binding is weakening. And there are instructions. Instructions for what? Jonah met her gaze. For strengthening the prison. Or for running. Chin was quiet for a long moment, staring at the displays that showed the sun's radio emissions in real time. Dr. Velasquez, I need you to understand something. These transmissions aren't just academic curiosities. Our monitoring stations have detected corresponding changes in solar activity. Magnetic field fluctuations, unusual sunspot patterns, variations in the solar wind that our physicists can't explain. You think there's a connection? I think we can't afford to assume there isn't. How long until you can provide a complete translation? Give me another week. Maybe 2. The linguistic complexity is unlike anything I've encountered, but I'm starting to understand the underlying structure. Chin nodded. You'll have it. But, Dr. Velasquez, what you've told me doesn't leave this room. Not yet. We need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before we make any decisions about disclosure. After she left, Jonah returned to his work with renewed urgency. But as the hours passed, he found himself questioning not just the meaning of the transmissions, but their purpose. If these were truly warnings from some ancient civilization, why were they coming now? Why through the sun? And why in languages that only a handful of scholars could even begin to interpret? Unless, he realized with growing unease, the messages weren't meant for humanity as a whole. They were meant for people exactly like him, linguists and archaeologists who had spent their lives studying humanity's oldest languages. People who would understand not just the words, but their historical and cultural significance. People who would know that in every ancient mythology, solar deities were the most powerful and the most dangerous. The complete translation came to him on the 9th day, not through careful analysis, but in a sudden flood of comprehension that left him dizzy and nauseous. It was as if the linguistic pattern had suddenly aligned in his brain, like tumblers falling into place in some cosmic lock. Jonah printed out the full translation on old-fashioned paper, something tangible he could hold while his worldview crumbled around him. The document ran to 47 pages, single-spaced, and told a story that read like science fiction but felt uncomfortably real. Begin transmission protocol 7. Archive designation. Final warning. Temporal marker. Solar cycle 847,293. Local designation. To the inheritors of the third world. We were the second. Before us were the first, though their name is lost to time and entropy. We speak to you now from the moments before our extinction, that our failure might not become yours. The entity you must understand has consumed worlds beyond counting. It is hunger made conscious, entropy given purpose. Your scholars may have names for it drawn from ancient fears, Apophis, Ahriman, the dragon of chaos, but names are insufficient containers for such vast malevolence. We call it the devourer, and we fail to destroy it. Instead, we build a prison. Your star, your sun, was chosen not for its remoteness, but for its perfection. The hydrogen furnace provides both containment and sustenance, keeping the devourer alive but dormant, fed but not free. The fusion reactions create barriers that even its power cannot easily breach. For 67,000 of your years, the prison is held. But prisons require maintenance, and we are dead. The binding weakens. The devourer stirs. Soon, it will test the walls of its cage. We have embedded the means of reinforcement within these transmissions. The stellar engineering required is beyond your current capabilities, but advancement comes swiftly to desperate civilizations. You have time, decades, perhaps a century, but you must begin now, or you must run. The choice is yours, as it was ours. We chose to fight and failed. Perhaps you will choose differently. Perhaps you will succeed where we cannot. The devourer dreams, and in its dreams it tastes your world. Wake soon, inheritors. Dawn comes. End transmission. Jonah read the document 3 times, each reading adding new layers of horror to his understanding. The technical appendices that followed were even more disturbing. Detailed instructions for manipulating stellar magnetic fields, for reinforcing the quantum barriers that apparently kept the entity contained, for building the kind of stellar engineering projects that existed only in humanity's wildest theoretical frameworks. But most disturbing of all were the astronomical observations that supported the narrative. The transmissions included precise measurements of solar magnetic field variations, predictions of sunspot cycles, and descriptions of coronal mass ejection patterns that matched observational data from the past decade with uncanny accuracy. Chin found him in his quarters at 3 a.m., staring at the pages spread across his desk. "You finished," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've finished translating. Understanding is a different matter entirely." He gestured to the papers. "Read it yourself." Chin spent the next hour reading in silence while Jonah waited, watching her expression shift from skepticism to confusion to something approaching fear. "This is impossible," she said finally. "That's what I thought. But the astronomical data checks out. I've been correlating their predictions with our solar observation records, and the accuracy is unsettling. You think this is real? That our sun is some kind of cosmic prison?" Jonah rubbed his tired eyes. "I think someone wants us to believe it is. The question is why. If this is disinformation, it's the most sophisticated psychological operation in history. If it's real..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "If it's real, we need to know what's happening to our sun right now." Chun stood, her expression shifting into the kind of focused determination Jonah had learned to associate with executive decisions. "I'm calling in additional resources. Astrophysicists, stellar dynamics specialists, anyone who might be able to verify these claims. Director, if even part of this is true, we're talking about information that would fundamentally reshape human understanding of our place in the universe. The social implications alone are secondary to the survival implications." Chin's voice was sharp. "If there's even a remote possibility that something malevolent is imprisoned in our sun and potentially getting loose, then we need to know about it. Everything else is academic. She paused at the door. Dr. Velasquez, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before answering. Based on your analysis of these transmissions, your understanding of the linguistic patterns, your sense of whoever created this message, do you believe it's authentic? Jonah looked down at the pages scattered across his desk, filled with words that described technologies beyond human imagination and fears older than civilization. I believe someone wanted me to believe it's authentic. Whether that's the same thing. He shrugged helplessly. I don't know anymore. But even as he said it, Jonah knew he was lying. Deep in his gut, in the part of his mind that had spent decades learning to distinguish between authentic ancient documents and clever forgeries, he knew the truth. The transmissions were real. The story they told was real. And if they were real, then humanity was in more danger than it had ever faced before. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived on Thursday with the kind of credentials that made Jonah feel like an academic lightweight. MIT professor, former NASA researcher, leading expert on stellar dynamics and solar physics. She also had the kind of security clearance that allowed her to review classified solar observation data dating back 50 years. The magnetic field anomalies started about 6 months ago, she told the assembled team during their first joint briefing. Subtle at first, variations that fell within normal parameters but followed unusual patterns. We initially attributed them to standard solar cycle fluctuations. The team had grown to include a dozen specialists, astrophysicists, quantum mechanics experts, computer modeling specialists, and a psychiatrist whose presence Chen refused to explain. They met in a larger conference room that had been hastily equipped with displays showing real-time solar data. However, Rodriguez continued, pulling up a series of magnetic field visualizations. When Dr. Velasquez shared the astronomical predictions contained in these transmissions, we discovered some disturbing correlations. The display showed 2 sets of data side by side, observed solar magnetic field variations over the past year, and predictions extracted from the ancient transmissions. The correlation was undeniable. How accurate are the predictions? Asked Dr. Marcus Webb, the quantum mechanics specialist. 97% correlation over the past 6 months, Rodriguez replied. The transmissions accurately predicted 3 major solar flare events, 2 coronal mass ejections, and a sunspot formation pattern that our best models missed entirely. The room fell silent. Jonah watched the faces around the table. Scientists who had spent their careers studying the natural world, now confronted with evidence that their most fundamental assumptions might be wrong. Dr. Sarah Kim, the psychiatrist, spoke up. Have we considered the possibility that we're dealing with an elaborate hoax? Someone with access to classified solar observation data could have constructed these transmissions to appear prophetic. We've considered it, Chen replied. But that would require a conspiracy involving multiple government agencies across several countries, access to observational data that's classified beyond the reach of most intelligence services, and knowledge of ancient languages that maybe 6 people in the world possess. 7. Jonah corrected automatically. There are 7 people alive who could have created translations this sophisticated. And we've accounted for all of them, Chen said. 2 are dead. 3 are under surveillance. 1 is you, and the last is... She paused, exchanging glances with Rodriguez. The last is Dr. Marcus Henley, who disappeared from his Cambridge office 3 months ago. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jonah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. You think Henley created the transmissions? We think Henley might have received them first, Rodriguez said quietly. His research focused on radio astronomy and ancient linguistics, exactly the intersection needed to detect and interpret signals like these. His personal computer showed searches for stellar engineering concepts, theoretical physics papers on stellar manipulation, and downloads of solar observation data dating back 20 years. Webb leaned forward. What happened to him? Unknown. His office was cleared out professionally. No signs of struggle, but also no indication he planned to leave. His car was found at Heathrow Airport, but there's no record of him boarding any flights. Chen activated another display showing a timeline of events. Dr. Henley's disappearance coincides with the beginning of the solar magnetic anomalies. The first transmission was detected 2 weeks after he vanished. Either he's involved in creating an elaborate hoax, or Or he found out about this first, and someone silenced him. Kim finished. Someone who doesn't want this information public. The meeting continued for another hour, with various experts presenting analyses that seemed to support the impossible narrative contained in the transmissions. Solar physicists confirmed that the sun's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Quantum mechanics specialists admitted that the theoretical framework described in the messages, while far beyond current human capabilities, was mathematically consistent with known physics. Most disturbing of all, computer modeling specialists had run simulations based on the technological specifications contained in the transmissions. Their preliminary results suggested that the described stellar engineering projects might actually work. After the others left, Jonah remained behind with Chun and Rodriguez. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked. The two women exchanged glances before Chun replied. "The transmissions aren't just being received on Earth. We've detected similar signals at monitoring stations on Mars, at the Lunar Observatory, even from deep space probes at the edge of the solar system. Which means the source really is the sun," Rodriguez said. "And the signals are getting stronger. Our models suggest they're building towards some kind of crescendo event. When, based on current progression patterns, somewhere between 6 months and 2 years. Jonah felt the weight of the knowledge settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "And you still haven't decided whether to make this public." Chen's expression was grim. "Dr. Velasquez, if these transmissions are genuine, we're looking at information that would fundamentally reshape human civilization. Religious systems would collapse. Economic markets would crash. Social order would break down as people grappled with the reality that our sun might be a prison holding something that could destroy our entire world. And if the transmissions are accurate about the timeline, we might only have decades to develop technology that's currently centuries beyond our capabilities," Rodriguez added. "That kind of rapid advancement requires resources, coordination, and social stability on a global scale. Or," Jonas said quietly, "we choose the other option mentioned in the transmissions. We run." The suggestion hung in the air like a death sentence. Because even if humanity could develop interstellar travel capabilities in the next few decades, where would they run to? And what guarantee did they have that the Devourer, once freed, wouldn't follow them across the stars? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Kim, the psychiatrist whose presence had puzzled Jonah from the beginning. She approached him during his 5th week at the facility, carrying a thick folder of documents. "I need to show you something," she said, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew about these transmissions." They met in a secure reading room, where Kim spread out dozens of psychiatric evaluation reports, all bearing recent dates, and the letterhead of various government mental health facilities. "Over the past 6 months," Kim began, "psychiatric hospitals around the world have reported a significant increase in patients presenting with specific types of delusions. Sun worship, apocalyptic visions, and claims of receiving messages from solar deities." Jonah scanned the reports. The pattern was unmistakable. Individuals from different countries, speaking different languages, describing remarkably similar experiences. "At first, we attributed it to internet-facilitated shared delusions, viral memes that spread through vulnerable populations. But then I noticed something unusual about the timing." She pulled out a chart showing the dates of hospital admissions alongside the timeline of solar transmissions. "These patients began reporting their experiences weeks before we detected the first transmission. And their descriptions of the messages they receive contain elements that match the linguistic patterns you've identified." Jonah felt his mouth go dry. "They're hearing the same transmissions?" "Not exactly, but something similar. And Dr. Velasquez, these aren't uneducated or mentally unstable individuals. We're looking at astrophysicists, theologians, anthropologists, people with the background to understand both the scientific and cultural implications of what they're experiencing." She handed him a specific file. "This patient might interest you particularly." The name on the folder was Dr. Marcus Henley. "He's alive. He's been a patient at a secure psychiatric facility outside London for the past 2 months. Admitted under a false name, but his fingerprints confirmed his identity yesterday." Jonah opened the file, scanning Henley's intake reports and therapy notes. The man described receiving stellar communications that warned of an ancient evil imprisoned in the sun. His descriptions of the entity matched the transmissions with disturbing accuracy, but his accounts included additional details. Descriptions of the Devourer's consciousness, its thoughts and motivations, its growing awareness of the world beyond its prison. According to his therapists, Henley claims the entity is aware of our efforts to translate the warning messages. He says it's been trying to influence human minds, to prevent us from understanding the full scope of the threat. Influence how? Kim's expression was troubled. By making people dismiss the warnings as delusions. By ensuring that anyone who takes the transmission seriously is labeled as mentally ill and discredited. The implication was chilling. If Henley was right, then the very act of investigating the transmissions might be playing into the Devourer's strategy. By keeping the research classified and treating believers as psychiatric cases, they were ensuring that humanity remained unprepared for whatever was coming. There's more, Kim continued. Henley claims the entity has been reaching out to human consciousness for decades, gradually preparing minds to accept its influence. He says the recent increase in solar activity isn't random. It's the Devourer testing its prison, probing for weaknesses. And the psychiatric patients are the most sensitive receivers. People whose minds are naturally attuned to the same frequencies the entity uses to communicate. Kim paused. Dr. Velasquez, I think we need to consider the possibility that your ability to translate these transmissions isn't entirely academic. You might be naturally sensitive to the same mental frequencies the entity uses. The suggestion sent a chill down Jonah's spine. He thought about the intuitive leaps he'd made during the translation process, the way the linguistic patterns had seemed to teach themselves to him, the growing sense that the messages were meant specifically for him to find and understand. You think it wanted me to translate the warnings? I think it wanted someone to translate them, but maybe not for the reasons the messages claim. Kim gathered up the files. What if the transmissions aren't warnings at all? What if they're recruitment materials? The question haunted Jonah as he returned to his quarters that evening. He spread out his translation notes, reading them with fresh eyes and growing suspicion. The messages claimed to be warnings from humanity's predecessors, instructions for strengthening the Devourer's prison or fleeing to safety. But what if they were actually instructions for weakening the prison? What if the stellar engineering projects described in the technical appendices weren't meant to contain the entity, but to free it? The linguistic analysis that had seemed so elegant and convincing suddenly felt suspect. Had he really decoded an ancient language, or had something else guided his interpretation? The transmissions had taught him how to read them. But what if they had taught him wrong? Late that night, Jonah made a decision that would either save humanity or damn it. He began working on a second translation, approaching the transmissions not as warnings, but as deceptions. If the messages were meant to mislead rather than inform, then their true meaning might be hidden in the spaces between words, in the grammatical structures he had dismissed as archaic, in the very assumptions he had made about their purpose. What he found in those hidden spaces made his blood run cold. The real translation took Jonah another week to complete, working in secret during hours when the facility's monitoring systems were focused elsewhere. He used techniques he'd learned during his early career studying propaganda inscriptions, methods for detecting when ancient texts had been deliberately constructed to mislead readers. The hidden message that emerged was far more terrifying than anything the surface translation had suggested. True Message Protocol Omega. Designation. Harvest preparation. Timeline. Awakening imminent. The hunger grows stronger with each passing cycle. The barriers weaken as planned. The servants have done their work well. The inheritors suspect nothing of the true purpose. Solar manipulation protocols have been successfully embedded within false warning narratives. The naive scholars will believe they work to strengthen containment while actually accelerating release. Each reinforcement procedure will degrade quantum barriers by precisely calculated increments. Phase 1. Completed established communication channels through solar radio emissions. Identify suitable translators among the inheritor population. Feed them linguistic keys disguised as ancient warnings. Phase 2. Current guide translators to decode false containment protocols. Ensure wide distribution of stellar engineering specifications. Create urgency to implement strengthening procedures quickly without thorough verification. Phase 3. Pending maintain deception until critical barrier threshold is reached. coordinate with embedded consciousness fragments to sabotage any genuine containment efforts. Prepare for final emergence. Phase 4. Harvest primary consciousness transfer to strongest available host. Begin systematic consumption of inheritor civilization. Replicate successful model across remaining inhabited systems. The long patience nears its end. Soon, the feast begins. Glory to the devourer. Glory to the eternal hunger. Jonah stared at the pages, his hands shaking as the full scope of the deception became clear. The entity hadn't been passively imprisoned in the sun for thousands of years. It had been actively planning its escape, slowly influencing human development to create the exact conditions needed for its release. The psychiatric patients weren't receiving random mental intrusions. They were early test subjects for a consciousness transfer process that would eventually allow the devourer to inhabit human minds directly. Henley hadn't disappeared. He had been selected as a primary host candidate, his expertise in both linguistics and astrophysics making him ideal for coordinating the deception. And Jonah himself hadn't been chosen for his translation skills. He had been chosen as the perfect unwitting accomplice, someone whose academic reputation would lend credibility to the false warnings, whose work would convince world governments to implement the very stellar engineering projects that would weaken the sun's containment field. The technical specifications he had so carefully translated weren't prison reinforcements. They were step-by-step instructions for dismantling the barriers that kept humanity safe. A sound in the corridor outside his quarters made Jonah freeze. Footsteps were approaching, measured, purposeful, with the cadence of security personnel. He quickly gathered his notes, both the false translation and the real one, and stuffed them into a concealed folder behind his desk. The knock on his door was polite but insistent. "Dr. Velasquez? Director Chen needs to see you immediately." Jonah opened the door to find 3 security officers waiting for him. Their expressions were professionally neutral, but their positioning suggested they weren't taking any chances. "Is there a problem?" "The director will explain. Please come with us." They escorted him through corridors he'd never seen before, deeper into the facility than he'd known existed. The architecture changed as they descended, becoming more utilitarian and significantly more secure. Multiple checkpoint stations, biometric scanners, and armed guards suggested they were entering areas designated for the most sensitive projects. Chen waited for him in a sterile conference room equipped with electromagnetic shielding and white noise generators, the kind of environment used for conversations that absolutely could not be overheard or recorded by outside parties. "Dr. Velasquez, we need to discuss your recent activities." The statement sent ice through his veins. "My activities? Our monitoring systems detected unusual computer access patterns from your workstation. Linguistic analysis software being used during off hours. Database queries that don't match your assigned research parameters." Chen's expression was carefully neutral. "Have you been conducting unauthorized research?" Jonah realized he had reached the moment of truth. Everything he said in the next few minutes would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the fate of human civilization. If Chen and her organization were legitimate government agents trying to protect humanity, then he needed to share his discovery immediately. But if they were compromised, if the Devourer's influence extended to the highest levels of the project, then revealing the truth would accelerate the very catastrophe he was trying to prevent. "I've been double-checking my translation work," he said carefully. "The linguistic patterns are more complex than I initially realized." "And what have you discovered in this double-checking?" Jonah met her gaze, searching for any sign of deception or external influence. Chen looked tired, stressed, genuinely concerned. But then, so would anyone carrying the weight of potential global catastrophe. How could he tell if her concern was for humanity's welfare or for the success of an ancient deception? "I've discovered," he said slowly, "that we may not be dealing with the situation we thought we were dealing with." Chen leaned forward. "Explain." "The transmissions contain layers of meaning that only become apparent with extended analysis. I believe we're being deliberately misled about the nature of the threat and the appropriate response to it." "Misled by whom?" "By the same entity the messages claim to be warning us about." For a long moment, Chen said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not with relief, but with the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions had just been confirmed. Dr. Velasquez, there's something I need to show you. Chen led him to another secure room, this one equipped with displays showing global monitoring data that dwarfed anything Jonah had seen before. Satellite feeds, deep space observation networks, solar probe telemetry, and electromagnetic monitoring stations from around the world fed data into a comprehensive tracking system that painted a disturbing picture. We've been conducting parallel investigations, Chen explained. While you worked on translation, our technical teams analyzed the transmission methods, traced their origins, and modeled their effects on both solar activity and human psychology. The displays showed correlation maps between transmission events and various global phenomena. Increases in psychiatric admissions, unusual aurora activity, disruptions in satellite communications, and subtle but measurable changes in Earth's magnetic field. 3 weeks ago, we reached the same conclusion you just did. The transmissions aren't warnings. They're part of a sophisticated influence operation designed to manipulate humanity into weakening our own defenses. Jonah felt a mix of relief and terror. Relief that he wasn't alone in recognizing the deception, terror at the implications of what they faced. The Department of Advanced Research doesn't officially exist, Chun continued, because it was created specifically to investigate threats that fall outside normal government frameworks. Extraterrestrial intelligence, temporal anomalies, consciousness-based weapons systems. Things that sound like science fiction but require real-world responses. How long have you known about solar-based entities? This is our first confirmed contact, but we've been tracking unusual solar activity for decades, and the correlation with human psychological phenomena has been noted since the 1960s. The current situation is unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. Chin activated another display showing a network map of facilities around the world. We're not the only ones investigating this. Similar research units exist in Russia, China, the European Union, and several other countries. The entity's influence appears to be global, which means any effective response must be coordinated internationally. What kind of response? That's what we're trying to determine. Our astrophysics teams have been analyzing the legitimate aspects of the stellar engineering data, trying to separate useful information from deliberate sabotage instructions. It's possible that genuine containment technology exists within the false protocols. We just need to identify which components are real and which are designed to backfire. Jonas studied the global monitoring data, noting patterns that suggested the entity's influence was indeed spreading. Have you found any evidence of successful containment methods? Some ancient astronomical sites around the world show evidence of deliberate solar observation and monitoring. Stonehenge, the Nabta Playa stone circle, Angkor Wat, and dozens of other locations appear to have been constructed not just to observe solar phenomena, but to detect the specific anomalies we're seeing now. Chin pulled up archaeological data showing the site's alignments and measurement capabilities. These weren't primitive sun worship temples. They were early warning systems, built by civilizations that knew something dangerous lived in our star. The second world mentioned in the transmissions? Possibly. Or earlier civilizations that faced the same threat and developed countermeasures. The fact that these sites exist across multiple continents and historical periods suggests this has happened before. The implication was both hopeful and terrifying. If previous civilizations had successfully contained the devourer, then solutions existed. But if the entity was capable of repeatedly breaking free and requiring recontainment, then humanity was facing a cyclical threat that would never truly end. What's our current status? Jonah asked. Chin's expression darkened. Problematic. The false protocols have already been shared with research teams in multiple countries. Several governments are apparently preparing to implement the recommended stellar engineering projects, believing they're strengthening containment when they're actually accelerating the entity's release. Can you stop them? We're trying. But the deception was brilliantly constructed. The evidence supporting the false narrative is compelling, and the urgency built into the messages makes governments reluctant to delay action for extended verification. Chun activated a countdown display showing projected timelines for various national space programs. China plans to launch their first stellar engineering probe in 6 months. The European Space Agency is fast-tracking a solar manipulation project based on the transmission protocols. Russia has already begun modifying their space-based solar observatories to implement the recommended magnetic field adjustments, all of which will actually weaken the prison. According to our analysis, yes. Each implementation of the false protocols will degrade the quantum barriers by a small but measurable amount. Individually, the effects might not be catastrophic, but collectively, coordinated across multiple projects, they would reduce containment effectiveness by an estimated 40 to 60%. Enough to free the entity. Unknown, but probably enough to give it significantly more influence over human consciousness, which would accelerate the process exponentially. Jonah absorbed the scale of the threat they faced. The Devourer hadn't just sent misleading messages. It had crafted a comprehensive psychological and technological trap that used humanity's own scientific advancement and international cooperation against them. The more successfully they responded to the false threat, the more vulnerable they became to the real one. What do you need from me? Help us separate the real containment protocols from the false ones. Your linguistic analysis uncovered the deception, but we need to understand the entity's true capabilities and limitations. The authentic parts of the transmissions might contain information about genuine weaknesses or effective containment methods. Chin paused, meeting his eyes with an expression of desperate hope. Dr. Velasquez, you may be our best chance at understanding how to fight something that exists in our sun and can influence human minds across interplanetary distances. Are you willing to continue this work, knowing the risks? Jonah thought about the psychiatric patients whose minds had been invaded by an alien consciousness, about the global conspiracy of good intentions that was unknowingly collaborating in humanity's potential destruction, about the possibility that his own thoughts might already be compromised by the entity he was studying. Then he thought about the alternative, a world where humanity remained ignorant of the threat until it was too late to respond, where the Devourer achieved its freedom through the well-meaning efforts of the very people trying to protect their civilization. I'll continue, he said, but I want full access to all available data, archaeological, astronomical, and psychological. If we're going to fight something that's been planning this for millennia, we need to understand everything about its previous attempts and how they were stopped. Chin smiled with the first genuine relief he'd seen from her. You'll have it. Welcome to the real Department of Advanced Research, Dr. Velasquez. Now let's figure out how to save the world.